Hello. This is principle number 3 of our mini series on the philosophy of flourishing, trying to arrive at a reasoned definition as to what flourishing is. So then we can go and pursue how to attain it and how to flourish. This is principle 3, get out into the world, follows off the back of using your head and trusting your gut, and just before embracing your humanity, which will come out next week. I really enjoyed writing this essay because it involves a lot of the people and the philosophers that I really, really enjoy reading and kind of align myself with, or want to align myself with. And these are extraordinary people and singular intellects, and quite amazing to read. But they also lived their philosophy. We talk here of Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 19th century American philosopher, who lived, having broken with the Unitarian Church in the 1830s, ended up living in nature and really trying to understand a kind of pantheistic version of the world and of philosophy. We talk a lot about Montaigne, as we always do, because I love him and he's great. This time we're talking about his travels through Europe, getting out into the world, seeing, observing, being part of the mix and the melee. We talk about G.K. Chesterton, the British, I don't know what you would call him, British philosopher, thinker, writer, essayist, early 20th century, who talks about wanting to see the world, but actually you see more of the world by just connecting with your neighbor than you do by traveling the world. We have a good discussion about spirituality and God and things like that towards the end. But I think the best part of this essay probably comes in YouTube form. At the beginning of the essay, or a few minutes into it, I talk about the film Good Will Hunting. This was a film I watched in the early hours of the morning whilst looking after my not sleeping daughter. And there's just one scene when they're sitting on the park bench. If you've seen the film, you can probably imagine it. And it just represents everything that I wanted to talk about with regards to getting out into the world and actually seeing and touching and smelling and hearing things, as opposed to just reading from a textbook or consuming them in your dark office. So I hope, A, you enjoy this essay, and B, you go and watch the film, or at least the excerpt of them sitting on a park bench. Robin Williams, what a fantastic actor. Anyway, on with the essay. The philosophy of flourishing. Principle 3, get out into the world. To exist is to be an active participant in the wider world. We cannot be isolated from the limitless external forces that shape us, as much as some philosophers would like to treat the human specimen as a science experiment, isolated entirely from external variables. It is neither possible nor instructive. To flourish is to go out into the world, to engage, observe, and live, out there in full view. It is only then that we can return to our thinking selves and acknowledge how these experiences and interactions have changed us. Flourishing is an active, immersive state. It involves going places, doing things, meeting people, and taking action. We can only start to flourish if we feel like we are asserting our agency on the world around us. We are shaped by the act of pushing ourselves out into the world, whose forces consequently press back upon us, creating the curves and the creases of a life well lived. Conversely, passivity, although at times pleasant, can never induce flourishing. For 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, this is all important. It is only by observing the act of living that one can recognize what constitutes a life of flourishing. As he says, I do not portray being, I portray passing. Therefore, Montaigne wants to get to the truth of being human, not through abstraction or logical deductions, but through studious observation and insatiable curiosity. However, Montaigne would also be careful to assert that we cannot flourish by acting as disinterested observers, as flâneurs, coolly detached from the passions of real life. As Montaigne rightly concludes, my actions would tell more about fortune than about me. It is not my deeds that I write down, it is myself, it is my essence. If we spend all day locked in our room, ruminating on what it means to flourish, we will end up missing out on life's wonderful texture. Textbooks and encyclopedias only serve as two-dimensional representations of the limitless depth and cosmic breadth of our shared experience. To flourish is to get out into the world, feeling, seeing, touching, and smelling things firsthand. In the 1997 film Good Will Hunting, Sean, the wise counselor, so wonderfully played by Robin Williams, explains to his patients with brevity and grace the chasm that exists between the textbook and life. And I quote, "So if I asked you about art, you'd probably give me the skinny on about every art book ever written. Michelangelo, you know a lot about him. Life's work, political aspirations, him and the Pope, sexual orientation, the whole works, right? But I bet you can't tell me what it smells like in the Sistine Chapel. You've never actually stood there and looked up at that beautiful ceiling." He continues, addressing Will, his precocious patient. "You're a tough kid. If I ask you about war, you'd probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach, dear friends. But you've never actually been near one. You've never held your best friend's hand in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath, looking to you for help. As he comes into land, he speaks about the gut-wrenching reality of giving yourself wholly to someone else. If I ask you about love, you'd probably quote me a sonnet, but you've never looked at a woman and been totally vulnerable. Known someone who can level you with her eyes, feel like God put an angel on earth just for you, who could rescue you from the depths of hell, and you wouldn't know what it's like to be her angel, to have that love for her be there forever, through anything, through cancer. And you wouldn't know about sleeping, sitting up in the hospital room for 2 months, holding her hand because the doctors could see in your eyes that the terms visiting hours don't apply to you. It is one of the most profound, moving pieces of cinema, precisely because it gets to the heart of it all. That to flourish is to be exposed, to be vulnerable, to put in the work of living. To flourish is not to sit on a pedestal or behind a keyboard, drolly observing but never quite jumping into the melee. To flourish is to shape and be shaped by the world around us. The world, according to our philosophers. For Montaigne, to flourish was to be an observer of and an active participant in the curious world that surrounded him. When he was 47, Montaigne set off to see Europe. He would not return home to his family estate for 17 months as he traveled through France and down into Italy, making the pilgrimage to Rome before meandering back through the Dolomites into Austria and Germany before concluding his travels in Paris. Along the way, he observed Protestant churches in Germany, witnessed the christening of a child in Augsburg, and visited synagogues in Italy, at one point witnessing a Jewish circumcision in a family home. He was fascinated with the limitless differences of his fellow human, collecting anecdotes like trinkets of a soldier who had a half-white beard and one white eyebrow, or of a group of girls in Vitry-le-Français who had committed to dressing and living as men. He is obsessed with the minutiae of culture and custom, noting that in Saxony, they dust their glassware with a hair duster attached to the end of a stick. Montaigne concludes in his essays that man is indeed a marvelously vain, diverse, and undulating object. It is hard to found any constant and uniform judgment on him. As we know, traveling has its joys and benefits, but we do not need to play the flaneur languidly sipping espresso, a listless arm raising a cigarette aloft, observing the fair and the thoroughfare in cafes across Europe, to understand human flourishing. In fact, it is often in the presence and permanence of our immediate surroundings where enduring contentment and flourishing can occur. Often we travel to escape, running away from the petty neighbors and the gridlock traffic, the daily microaggressions and the howling dogs and honking cars, the screaming children and their heavy-eyed parents. But for British author G.K. Chesterton, we are really fleeing from our street because it is a great deal too exciting. Getting out into our local neighborhood, our local community, is where the somewhat overstimulating diversity of humanity resides. As Chesterton notes, if we were, tomorrow morning, snowed up in the street in which we live, we should step suddenly into a much larger and much wilder world than we could have ever known. He concludes that instead of feeling a fleeting sense of achievement by navigating our way around a foreign city, the best way that a man could test his readiness to encounter the common variety of mankind would be to climb down a chimney into any house at random and get on as well as possible with the people inside. While Montaigne satisfied his curiosity in the cultures and communities he visited, and Chesterton found answers to the universe on his front doorstep, for Ralph Waldo Emerson, it was in nature, the woods and the forests, the prairies and the mountains, that we can truly enter an elevated understanding of our unity with everything around us. Nature has the wonderful ability to ground us firmly in the moment. When in nature there is no history, no church or state. Like the roses climbing under the window of his Massachusetts home, which make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are what they are. They exist with God today. To flourish is to get out in nature, to feel connected with the infinity of objects and miracles that humans have happily had no hand in divining. We find peace in nature. It is an elemental sense of belonging, of returning home, the reassuring familiarity of the texture of rock, the serenity of a babbling stream, or the shimmer of sunlight through pine trees. Emerson expands his definition of nature to explore the vital relationship between ourselves and the interconnected world that surrounds us. Emerson compels us to exist not as a floating brain abstracted from the world around us, but instead to live within and as part of nature. Here, Emerson defines nature as anything outside of the mind, including communities, art, and even our own bodies. It is important to be a conscious part of the world, as only then can we start to understand and contextualize how we fit within the wider scheme of things. Emerson compels us to study and be an active part in the macrocosm in order to better understand and contextualize the microcosm of our being. Only by turning our gaze outwards can we arrive at a unity between ourselves and the greater whole of nature, achieving peace by putting our problems into their proper perspective and recognizing the function of a life well lived as a small but important cog in a much wider, transcendent whole. Emerson describes the relationship between the individual and the elemental forces of our world as the oversoul. To Emerson, the oversoul is the common thread within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all others. By being part of the great pulsing soul of the whole, we can center ourselves, framing the patchwork of parts and particles into an all-encompassing whole. Most of Emerson's contemporaries would define this oversoul as God, lying firmly within the Western Christian tradition. But to Emerson, who broke with the Unitarian Church in the 1830s, formal religion was an artifice, placed on top of the true experience of God within us. He speaks not of the formality of religious ceremony, but of the revival of the Calvinistic churches and the experiences of the Methodists as varying forms of that shudder of awe and delight with which the individual soul always mingles with the universal soul. By acknowledging our very human pursuit of the spiritual, the anchoring of the soul, and the sense that we are part of a unified whole, Emerson places the broad church of faiths, belief, and religions as elemental for flourishing. To flourish is to be out in the world, experiencing life's rough edges and smooth textures. To be out in the world is to gain much needed context, relieving us from the pressure that comes from being at the center of the universe and instead placing us as just one small part of a much greater whole. Whether it's a grand tour through Europe, a stroll in nature, or exchanging small talk with a neighbor, our philosophers agree that we must get out into the world in order to flourish. By getting out into the world, we get to witness humanity in all its idiosyncratic glory. But that is for next time.